And welcome into the Roundtable. Bill Priestley here along with our enterprise trucking expert, Thomas Wasson. And joining us remotely is Alan Adler, our Detroit Bureau Chief, joining us from up in Michigan. Alan, thanks so much for joining us. We're going to be talking about winners and losers here in this early period of kind of, shall we say, a horse race in terms of what's going on in the new trucking industry. So let's just, I'll break this down very broadly here, Alan. Who are, say, for instance, as we get early on in the race, who's out in front? Who are the early winners?
Well, it's funny, and good morning, you guys, Bill and Thomas. It's interesting. We're seeing a separation now, and I think what you can do is you can look at companies, young companies, startups that came into life via special purpose acquisition companies or SPACs. And what happened is all these companies got a big chunk of money in the early days. When they did their mergers, that gave them life and breath in the early days, if you believe that oxygen is money and vice versa. Now what we're seeing is a number of these companies that clearly were not ready to go public. They went prematurely. They went early before they really knew how to run a business, not just have a good idea, but execute on it. So what we're seeing is a separation between some haves and some have-nots. And let me give you a couple of quick examples. The two that are probably most notable right now, at least in my mind, are Nikola, which is a bit of a surprise, and Hyliion, two early SPACs in terms of kind of coming to life in 2020 through mergers. Each of them has recently completed an acquisition of another company.
Yeah, it's interesting the way that these companies, of course, you mentioned Nikola, which is a great surprise, of course, given the fact that they took on Romeo Battery not too long ago as well, and Hyliion with their acquisition there. Maybe who's looking up a little bit right now in terms of trying to catch up a little bit?
Well, I think you've got all of let's just talk about autonomous trucking companies, because several of them, did go public. Too Simple did it the old-fashioned way with a traditional IPO, and they priced out around $40 initially. They're trading today under $10, and there's a lot of pressure on Too Simple around that recent crash that really isn't that big a deal, but it got a lot of attention. And even though it has a lot of the Wall Street analysts on its side with a lot of positive recommendations, there's not much happening from a share price perspective. They are continuing to hit their milestones. They were the first of the autonomous companies to do a driver out demonstration. And so they're still kind of your clubhouse leader, but they're under pressure from a stock perspective and arguably from a credibility perspective because of all of the changes in management there with the literal takeover by the founder, Xiao Hao. So that's one. I think they're still definitely in a good position, although again, under pressure stock-wise. Some of the other autonomous companies that went public via SPAC, and one of the companies that we've written a fair amount about is Embark Truck. Now, they recently had to do a 1-for-20 stock exchange. And the reason for that, I don't know the exact NASDAQ rules, but the New York Stock Exchange requires that you trade over $1 a share for 30 consecutive days to keep your listing. I'm not sure if NASDAQ is exactly that or not. But Embark got well under $1 a share and therefore had to do something to boost its share price. So consequently, there are fewer outstanding shares now than there were. But the stock is back up, around $10. I'm not sure where it is this morning. But I think the whole point is that some of these companies are sweating out how they're going to be able to capitalize their growth and make it to commercialization. It's not that they don't have the technology. They clearly do, but will they have enough money to get there?
Gotcha. Thomas, let me switch it to you just a little bit, because you're looking at, say, for instance, enterprise trucking. We're looking at the big carriers, especially the big carriers, and obviously those are the big whales that everybody wants to get to. Are they paying attention to this right now, or is this something that they're looking at and saying, okay, at some point we're going to jump in, or are we trying to wait back, proof of concept, let's see how this is going to go before we dive in?
Well, large carriers in general, we're definitely seeing the weight proof of concept, small testing, with JB Hunt partnerships, Covenant testing a Nikola truck, as well as various other large carriers. The reason we're waiting and holding back is long-haul trucking really relies on three big things that right now autonomous trucks as well as electric vehicles can't do, which is range. How am I going to deal with the infrastructure while I'm going long distances? Reliability. How are these things going to operate in weather? Current testing with Too Simple and others is in the Sun Belt. And so studies do show that weather is going to be a big factor. Just asking any Tesla owner. And then finally, it's going to be business. How do we change our business model to where we're going to a modified hub and spoke model? How are we going to be moving these autonomous units long haul? What does that do to our driver population? What does it do to our office staff? How do we build all of this around? So you're a large carrier right now. It's just kind of like a situation for hurry up and wait, because at the end of the day, we're seeing more movements like you see with JB Hunt and Schneider, where they're going into intermodals and upstream versus trying to really go drastically into over the road revolutionary, trying to make it better.
Sure, yeah. Alan, let's jump back into, you mentioned, of course, the two SPACs that had done some acquisitions there before. In this quote-unquote horse race, it's not just who you're running against, but who you can run with there as well. Do you expect to see a lot of these companies maybe start to think about, if you're going from autonomous to fuel to battery to all of these different technologies, do you see these companies pairing up in the future?
I think it's inevitable that you're going to see a shakeout, and sometimes that does mean combinations. I asked the question directly last week of Don Burnett. Don will be one of our speakers during the Autonomous Electric Vehicle Summit on the 7th, coming up September 7th, and he's coming into Chattanooga. We're going to talk to him live, but I've talked to Don pretty regularly, and I flat out asked him, I said, you and Embark Truck do roughly the same thing in the same way. Do you see the two of you getting together at some point? Embark did go public. Don Burnett and Kodiak Robotics did not. They have raised money and through venture capital and investments from other companies and so forth. I said, do you see the two of you getting together? He says, well, we haven't had any conversations. That didn't say he wouldn't have any conversations, but as you look at some of the way these companies fit and what their skills are and things like that, there are some, I don't want to say logical, but there are some combinations that would not be impossible to see. I want to go back to Nikola for just a second. Their acquisition, $144 million all-stock purchase of Romeo Battery, or Romeo Technology, was a necessary thing because Romeo was, Nikola was Romeo's biggest customer for battery packs. The only way that Nikola could be sure it would get battery packs was to basically own the business. Romeo's been struggling. They were another stock that was, under $1 and probably headed for failure. So this bailout, this rescue, if you will, not only assured Nikola's supply chain for battery packs, but it also, gives them a brand new facility and a number of other advantages. The one last week with Highland was fascinating because it was a pure technology play. And in the story, we even referenced Back to the Future because this technology sounds an awful lot like a flux capacitor, but it's not. That is a generator, quite honestly. It can run on 20 different types of fuel, including mixing of those fuels to make electricity. No banana peels, no garbage like in Back to the Future, but definitely the kind of stuff that sort of strange credulity, but I think it must work, or Thomas Healy and Highland wouldn't have spent $37 million to buy it. But anyway, I think Thomas is spot on in terms of what the trucking industry is doing. We saw Craig Harper last week in Indiana. He's he manages all of that advanced technology work for JB Hunt, and he's very high on what the work that they're doing with Waymo Via is, and the number of runs they're doing and things like that. But there's no way this is going to be ready for prime time anytime soon. And even as Waymo begins to test out, fully redundant trucks, meaning that they have backup braking, steering, and so forth, we're still a ways off. What we are starting to see, though, guys, is longer runs with autonomous trucks. That is, they've always been seen as hub to hub, but now some of these runs that are going from, say, Atlanta to Dallas or El Paso to Phoenix and that kind of thing, those things are starting to come to pass. They're starting to test out their legs a little bit to see just how well they can do with this. Again, we're down the road on this stuff. It's coming. Some of them just need to make sure they have enough money to do it.
We've got about 2 minutes left or so. Alan, looking at it right now, obviously we've talked about some companies that have jumped out a little bit ahead, at least have gotten their share of the headlines. What about maybe other companies, maybe even companies that have been around a while, like Cummins, who have obviously been around for a long time, and then also have a very big eye on the future? What do you see them? How do you see them figuring into this big horse race?
Well, again, a plug for the AEV conference. I spent some time last week with Mike Taylor, who is the head of global powertrain integration for Cummins. He'll be one of our guests on the AEV summit. And Cummins is working with a lot of these startups in terms of doing the powertrain integration pieces that guys like Alex Rodriguez at Embark and Don Burnett don't really want to get into. They don't want to have to do this work. They're not really experts at it. Of course, they're engineers, but what you're looking at is taking the expertise of a company like a Cummins, which really is quite well heeled. They're in the process. They just finished the purchase of Meritor for $3.7 billion. So no question about their future. But they are involved in a lot of these things, a lot of these areas that quite honestly are going to enable some of this technology. They will be big on the electrification side themselves because of the acquisition of Meritor, both from a components perspective as well as e-axles and things like that.
Gotcha. Thomas, anything? Obviously, we talked a little bit about Covenant and Nikola and things. Are you hearing anything else in terms of how maybe big companies, big carriers are looking at it and maybe any moves that they're making now?
I'd say looking at Marathon versus Sprint, don't count out Daimler and Torque AI. What they're doing as well is very interesting because they're taking it from an OEM manufacturer approach, all in-house, working to design it, but also use it as an expansion of their service and not try to compete. So we've talked a lot about startups that are burning and sprinting. I think keeping an eye on some of those that are on a marathon mode, definitely the Torque AI folks, just because there's a lot of cool things under the hood that we see, but having the OEM backing, it's going to be really fascinating to watch.
It's going to be very fascinating to watch. Good, Alan.
And Daimler,
real quick.
just to close out real quick, I don't want to take too much time, but Daimler just put their own person in charge of Torque now. It was Michael Fleming's startup back in 2005 out of Virginia Tech. It is not a startup. They were actually profitable for years, but the fact is that Daimler is now taking such an interest, they put their own autonomy guy in charge of the thing.
All right. Well, gentlemen, we'll have to leave it there. It's going to be an interesting race as to see who gets to whatever the finish line is. We'll have to see what that is, of course, in the coming months and years and perhaps decades in the future. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
All right. We'll take a short break and we'll come back with more after this.